Hi, everybody. So today in our class, we're going to be talking about um, the role of archives for historians. Um, for historians, like archives are kind of the whole game in a way, because how else do we know what happened in the past? We can ask people what happened um, if they're still alive and still around. This is the whole concept of oral history, which we're going to talk about a little bit more later in the semester. Um, all these issues with like memory and um, what is an eyewitness account is not always like necessarily the most reliable thing. We'll talk about the film by Errol Morris called The Thin Blue Line, which is about how like eyewitness testimony can be very bad. Um, but we either ask people what happened or we try to find some documents, some shreds of evidence of what actually occurred. That's basically the whole deal for historians. Historically, traditionally, that meant going into archives and reading the papers that were collected of like the governor of North Carolina or um, Sir Mountbatten or whatever, and looking at like, okay, well, he wrote a letter to the Kaiser. He said this on July 2nd, 1885, and just building our history out of that. Now, certainly that's changed and grown a lot, um, especially since the 1950s or 1960s, of historians looking at a lot more stuff, not just the papers of great men, presidents, and generals, but like trying to work with different resources. So that's what we're going to talk about today, the significance of the archive for historians. We're going to talk later in the semester about like material culture, which is a very different type of archive, a very different way of like, looking at like the gloves that some guy who worked in a steel mill wore, or looking at the kitchen implements and pots and pans of a mining family in Colorado in the 1930s, and trying to understand what their lives were like. So there's a vast array of historical evidence to work with. But to talk about the archive itself, I'm going to put these slides on our class website, so you can kind of follow along with them there. But just to think about like what the archive really means for historians, for instance, for me, I spent a lot of the last year digging through any documents I could find in Los Angeles about an individual and a family that I'm trying to write about. And when I went to like a hospital where this person worked, they had an archive. It was just like 2 or 3 boxes full of just random shit that they had, thank God, like actually kept, but it was not organized. It was not, it was not what we would normally think of as an archive. When you go to our special collections at Georgia State University, you can look at the labor history archive. You can look at like the women's history archive. Everything's organized. There are boxes and there are folders and there's numbers on each folder. So you can, if you're working on a thesis or an article or something, you can go and say, well, okay, I looked at this letter or this flyer for some sort of movement or protest or something like that. And it's in box 233 in folder 13, page 2 of this letter that Gloria Steinem wrote to Ralph McGinnis or something. Like that is like, you can do that kind of research right here in Atlanta in Georgia. You can go to the Auburn Avenue Research Library, and they have incredible archives there as well. But the archives I was looking at this hospital, this mental hospital in LA, were just a bunch of random crap that they had kind of like just kept for some reason, but it was all completely disorganized. But that was a way for me to like actually get some really important information. about the people I was trying to write about and this institution. So it was great. Thank goodness they kept it. So what we're talking about today is the voice of the archive, power and knowledge in the making. So let's just go from there. So much of like what makes us human, I think, what makes us human, I think, in a lot of ways, is our expressive capabilities. The fact that like some cavemen 50,000 years ago started like making drawings or developing language and expressing themselves. And then at some point, you have the development of writing, as we would understand now, like with, potentially an alphabet, something that could be transmitted over space and time. There are things that we can read that people wrote 2,500 years ago or 700 years ago. You wouldn't have something like the Bible or the Quran, really, unless things were written down. I mean, there are obviously oral traditions, but this obsession that like contemporary religions have with the text and with following the letter to the T of what the scriptures say, whatever religion you're a part of, is based on a textual kind of culture. So there's this great sorry, there's this great quote from Galileo. Galileo said, the great scientist, "But of all other stupendous inventions, what sublimity of mind must have been his who conceived how to communicate his most secret thoughts to any other person, though very far distant either in time or place, and with no greater difficulty than the various arrangement of 24 little signs upon paper. Let this be the seal of all the admirable inventions of man." So this was Galileo speaking hundreds of years ago about like we make these little squiggles on paper and they mean something to somebody, right? If you go a little bit further back to like the 400s BC with the great Greek playwright Sophocles, Sophocles said, "Nothing vast enters the life of mortals without a curse." So once writing is introduced as a technology, as a medium, then you could say like, well, maybe this is incredible. Like maybe this is not so good. Socrates famously felt that like writing was bad, actually. The same way that people say like smartphones or video games are bad now. That Socrates was like, well, if you write everything down, you can't like have a debate with it. It's all just there, and it's going to substitute for your memory. Like, if we just rely on books and writing, then we're not going to remember stuff. And Socrates was kind of right. Like, I mean, I don't exactly remember which years Grover Cleveland was president of the United States, but I don't need to know that because I can just literally go on my iPhone and like ask or a chat GPT or something. And it's just there. I mean, it's a substitute brain and memory for me, right? And it is for everyone. But Socrates looked at that and just the original technology of writing or print. Well, print was going to be a way off, but like just writing. Socrates was like, this isn't good. Like we need to have like dialogue with each other. We need to debate things. When you write something down and it's just fixed in place, then like, it's dead. It's fixed. Socrates really believed in the idea of like debate and dialogue. And he thought that these books, these written documents, would be a substitute for our own personal memory. As a lover of reading and literature, I have to say I disagree with Mr. Socrates, but I think he did have a point in some ways. So, I mean, to get back to the point, if you're are doing historical research, there are archives everywhere. Almost every town, every county has a little historical society that collects documents, and especially universities like Georgia State or UGA or University of North Carolina have, um, physical archives and boxes of papers of everybody under the sun. And then when you look at things like YouTube or SoundCloud, then there's like a much vaster archive that people can draw from. So I just want to talk about like the way we do this. So if you go to like unc.edu and just search on Google for UNC special collections. So you'll see the Lewis Round Wilson Library, and there are these things called finding aids. A finding aid is just a document that sort of lists everything that is in that collection. So say, for a boring example, the papers of former North Carolina Governor Terry Sanford. I've gone through these documents, and it is very boring. But like, he was the governor of this state in the early 1960s and later a senator. And so like they'll have things that are just like invitations that were sent to the governor that he either replied to or did. A whole folder just of that. I went through those. They were not helpful for what I was doing. But but when you use a finding aid, it just lists like, okay, box one has the early life of this person. Box two has, records from their first political campaign. Box three has papers from their first health visits. Basically, a finding aid. So if you're trying to do research, you can just like look at the finding aid and be like, okay, I need to look at box 32 because that's the part about LGBT issues that the governor dealt with or something, whatever. So if you're going to an archive at Georgia State or any other university, there's going to be this thing called a finding aid that tells you how to literally find this stuff. It is literally a finding aid. So if you look up the Southern Oral History Project at UNC, they have a lot of resources that are incredible. Like all these, a lot of them record like sound recorded interviews with people in Southern history who had done something significant, but also transcripts. And so there's a lot that you can do there. That's the beauty of archives. So when we think about all this is about like recording the human experience, and writing was, probably the most fundamental of them, but not the only. When we get to things like sound recording or film, video, various digital technologies, there are many ways of recording the human experience. So the question is like, what was actually the first medium of expression for early humans? I think if you think about it a little bit, like long before writing or alphabets became technologies that people could use, we think about cave paintings, right? There are the paintings in this particular cavern and these walls in France, in Lascaux, that are considered to be some of the earliest expressions, like artistic or creative expressions of humans, that basically show like animals that they're hunting, and this is thought to be about 30,000 years ago. Again, look at the slides when I put them online to see the examples of this. But this is when, humans began to have this figurative, aesthetic, abstract way of thinking, of reflecting on their experiences. And they painted them on cave walls. The ones in France are some of the oldest ones, but not the only ones. So if you look at like very early human history, when there started to be agriculture and sort of sedentary societies, like as opposed to nomadic hunter-gatherer societies, like we're gonna park ourselves right here. We're gonna grow some wheat or some corn, and we're gonna have like priests and a king, and you know, this more highly developed, more organized society. So, like archives began to be important once humans started like etching things into clay tablets or walls or steels, as we're going to talk about. So basically, archives are as old as the beginning of agriculture and what we now think of as states or kingdoms. There's a guy named Ernst Posner who argued that the first archives were created by the Sumerians um, in what we would probably now call Iraq, um, in the middle of the fourth millennium BC. So, like 4,000 years before the birth of Jesus Christ. Um, and these records took the form of clay tablets with cuneiform characters. We're going to talk about cuneiform. The archives were used to support commercial activity and property ownership. I think it's very interesting that the beginning of like human, the recorded human experience and memory and scholarship is basically about like basically keeping the receipts. I sold you 2 goats and you gave me 1 pig because you owed me some debt and whatever. Basically, the beginning of like writing, as we understand it, like creating these little shapes on a paper or a tablet, came about because people were trying to keep track of their shit. So property and economics. The historian Elizabeth Yale has written about this, and she says a condensed history of archives and archiving might go something like this. Man invented agriculture. Writing followed soon after as a way of keeping account of the land and its produce. Across the globe, at its several different independent sites of invention, writing, skill in which was initially restricted to scribal elites, so like, the priesthood were the only people who could read or write, was a tool for those in power, a kind of external memory system. Remember the iPhone, Wikipedia? Allowing them to keep track of production and trade and levy taxes across the years. Records were generated. With agriculture, there was a need for storehouses of grain. With writing came a need for storehouses for records. Rulers accruing power through their control over resources. So you see what I mean? Like the only reason not the only, like one of the main reasons why we started writing stuff down and creating like languages and alphabets that were written is to keep track of people's shit. And like you owe me or I owe you. And we were making all these crops and wheat and stuff, like we need to keep track of all this stuff. That's kind of where a lot of like writing came from in the human experience. And so Yale goes on. Over the millennia, with the gradual, fitful expansion of states and their bureaucracies, writing came to be used to record more and more things, such as poetry, mythology, divination, music, and math, to name a few. And archives expanded too. So what Yale is saying here is that like it started out as just like keeping the receipts, but then it became something else. Official records of one kind or another now occupy thousands of miles of shelves and many terabytes of computer hard drive storage space. The United States National Archives, for instance, alone currently contains 10 billion pages of records and 133 terabytes of data, and it preserves less than 5% of government records generated in a given year. So we're generating a massive amount of data and information, and only like 5% of it's getting saved or recorded, and even that is like an insane amount of data. Archives have become, as Yale puts it, incidentally useful to historians and other sorts of scholars. So I guess what Elizabeth Yale is trying to say here is that like all this data, all this archives, all this recording of information serves a very utilitarian purpose for like governments and states and businesses and individuals, debtors and creditors and so forth. And she sort of comically says, also historians can make use of it, which is true. So like I just want to like kind of get across the idea that like um, what we as historians do is very much dictated by what got written down or what got recorded. Maybe it's an audio file of an oral history interview, or maybe it's, um, you know, a logbook of who came to a certain place, a club or a diner or bar, or maybe it's property records or tax records from a particular town in Missouri or something. But humans have been generating all this data for like a very long time, um, thousands of years. Um, and so when people first started sort of etching little shapes into clay tablets, they were basically like writing receipts. So then I really want to talk about this guy named Harold Innis. Harold Innis was this Canadian economist. Um, I can't think of more boring words than Canadian economist, but he had a pretty big influence. He wrote this book called The Bias of Communication in 1951, where he was trying to make an argument about like different modes of communication, different media, and how they influenced cultures and history. So I want to talk about this for a second. So if you look at like the early development of cuneiform, um, many writing systems of humans started with pictographs. Like I'll draw a picture of an elephant, or I'll draw a picture of a horse, or I'll draw a picture of a woman getting water from a well. Like they start with pictures and then they become more abstract. You can see this in many human languages. You look at like the 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 uh, the language of Mandarin, and I think a lot of the like little figures um, in a very distant time might have started with like illustrating some sort of very literal image, and then became increasingly abstracted. And that's certainly what happened in the West as well. So you look at something like, a tablet from Sumeria in what would now be southern Iraq. Um, there are these etchings on a clay tablet that are basically just keeping track of like how many how many sheep and goats someone had. Um, then you get to something like, about 1780 BC, the Stele of Hammurabi, this sort of obelisk thing that had the laws of the land written on it, Hammurabi's Code, one of the first, like, systematic legal codes. And so, we can still look at the Stele of Hammurabi because it was made in a very durable material and it's still there. You can go to a museum and look at it, even though that was, 2 or 3 thousand years ago. So, Hammurabi introduced one of the first uniform legal codes, and standardized things like written symbols, and we didn't quite have an alphabet yet, but like very standardization. Like if you want to rule an empire, you kind of have to have like standardization of communication, of written expression and language, things like calendars and weights and measures. So what Harold Innis would argue is that like it was really important for the early empires of human civilization to kind of, if they're going to exert their authority over a larger space, to have kind of standardized language and math and weights and measures, things like that. So you have the stele of Hammurabi, which is still around. It's this big, thing carved out of rock. But that's hard to move around. So you look at the development of things like papyrus in the ancient world, a precursor to what we would now call paper. And this was very light and movable. You can't carry around this gigantic obelisk everywhere. It's going to sit where it is. But you can write things down on a piece of papyrus. And so this technology emerged primarily from the Nile River Delta, just making something that would seem similar to paper to us, but was very fragile. And so what Harold Ennis would say is that there's this difference between technologies of space and time. Something like Hammurabi's stele, that obelisk with all the laws carved into it, is still around. So it endures through time, but it's hard to move around. Things like papyrus are very light, but they're also very fragile. So we don't have that many papyrus documents remaining today. They don't endure through time, but they're easily moved through space. Like you could make a little scroll and write some shit on it and take it over to Baghdad and show it to somebody. So what Harold Ennis was trying to get through is that each medium of technology of expression has its particular qualities. And radio is very ephemeral. When you listen to the radio, it just, for the most part, just disappears. You hear it in your car and it's there and gone. But radio can spread over a certain amount of space. With podcasts, that's a little bit different now. But with print and printed books that began in the 15th century, that's something you can write down things on a book and carry them around, and some books last a long time. With your iPhone, if it runs out of charge or you can't update the operating system, then it's very ephemeral. You might have your whole life story on that phone, but if you can't update it or you can't charge it, it's kind of gone. Printed and written books have a really good battery life. So that's something to think about. So one of the things Ennis talks about is that papyrus was very ephemeral, but it was very easy to move. If you're going to start an empire, you're going to try to conquer. You're Alexander the Great. You're trying to conquer a huge amount of space. Having things written down that can be easily moved is really useful, but those things might not last very long. In what we now call the Middle Ages or medieval period, parchment became a more common medium of expression. And parchment, by and large, was made from animal skins. And that's different from papyrus, which was made from a plant. Now, you could make these really beautiful books and scrolls from parchment, but if you're a desperately poor peasant, which almost everybody in history was, are you going to take your pig or your cow and turn them into a book? Or are you going to eat them and wear their skins as clothing? So parchment was a very durable technology as far as Harold Ennis is explaining, but it was also very expensive. So this is why during the Middle Ages, as we call them, or the medieval period, most knowledge was kind of, particularly, in Europe in particular, was kind of monopolized by the church. In this case, the Catholic Church. There were monks and priests who knew how to read. They read Latin. They had access to these scrolls and parchment books, these codices or codex things. But they were very expensive. To make a book out of parchment was very expensive and labor intensive. So the vast majority of people didn't have access to that in Europe until paper as the technology came from China, was moved through the Islamic world, and then into Europe in the 1100s or 1200s, I think. Just this idea that you could make this thing called paper, and it would be more durable than papyrus and not as expensive as parchment. What Harold Innis argues is that like the church occupied a monopoly of knowledge because the medium of communication, that is to say parchment, was very expensive and difficult to work with. So, you can go back and look at like medieval books and, scrolls. Um, well, there's the Codex Benedictus from the 11th century. These beautiful, like, very illuminated like texts and, painstakingly handwritten by monks. That's not very efficient. And that's the reason why, like, the vast majority of people didn't have access to the information. They just had to wait for their priest or monk to like tell them what was happening. So this is the idea of monopolies of knowledge. And eventually, you get to the development of print with Gutenberg in Europe. The Chinese kind of invented everything before Europeans did, but once paper as a medium becomes common in Europe, and then this guy Gutenberg comes up with the idea that you could have like little tiles of letters and we could just print the same thing over and over again, that really changes the game. And so, you have this revolution that happens in early modern Europe. It comes in fits and starts. There's a historiographical debate about like how much like the print revolution changed society and culture. It's very similar to the way we debate like how much the internet or smartphones have changed things. Um, Early on, a lot of historians and scholars thought that the minute like print, like the idea you could just print large numbers of books at low cost as opposed to like handwriting everything, that completely changed the world and it was this radical transformation. A lot of historians, such as Adrian Johns or our own Professor Nick Wilding, if you have taken a class with him, it's very cool, very interesting, have kind of been a little more skeptical about this. They don't think that like just because there was a printing press, it just suddenly changed the world and like, or at least changed Europe. That this development happened gradually over time. And so there are, there's a there are a lot of like historians you can look at about like the history of the book, which is what Professor Wilding focuses on. But in terms of what historians do, print is obviously a good thing because that like created vastly many more documents. If you try to study the year 700 CE or AD, there aren't that many documents because not that many people were literate, not that many people wrote things, and if they did, they wrote one copy of something. Whereas with printing, there's like thousands and thousands of copies of something. So when we work with archives, we're looking at people's like handwritten documents. We're looking at printed things like newspapers or flyers or just any kind of thing that could be mass produced to understand what was going on in 1735 or 1845 or 1976. These are the sources we usually look to. They're usually, for most historians, like textual things that are either written down or printed. That's where the vast majority of historical scholarship comes from to this day. We're going to talk more in the semester about other means that historians use, such as oral history, interviews, looking at material culture, things like that. But I just want to give this general overview of like how this medium of writing and then later print came to really define like what historians do. So we can talk about it a lot more. I do recommend looking at the work of Harold Ennis, who I mentioned earlier. He's a very influential theorist about media. He influenced Marshall McLuhan, who's one of the most influential media studies scholars, talking about like how radio or television or print or comic books like affect people in different ways. And we can follow that all the way up to the present. There are many different scholars who are thinking about like how media technologies, how people interact with them. We don't want to say, oh, the internet caused this or video games make people violent. Like we don't want to make it that simple, but we do want to think about like how different media of communication affect people in particular ways. Or there's this complex cultural dynamic between people and a printed novel, or um, you know the town crier who goes from town to town like yelling the news to people, um, or people who like get all their news from TikTok. Like each of these things is very unique and distinctive, and we need, as historians and scholars and journalists and so forth, to really understand how those things work and how people work with them. So that's what we're talking about. We're going to talk about it a lot more, but thank you for listening. All right. Bye, everybody.